Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story you think you already know. You've heard about Pa Ingalls, that gentle, noble father with the fiddle and the twinkling eyes, the man who built log cabins with his bare hands and taught his daughters about courage and resilience. You know him from Laura's books, from the TV show, from 100 retellings that turned him into something close to a saint. The perfect pioneer father, the embodiment of American frontier virtue. But tonight you're not meeting that man. Tonight you're meeting Charles Phillip Ingalls, as he actually was. The man who moved his family at least a dozen times across 4 states. The man who filed for government relief in 1876, signing a sworn statement that he was wholly without means just to get 2 half barrels of flour. The man whose brother-in-law stayed put in Wisconsin and prospered, while Charles chased horizons that kept disappearing. The man whose fiddle might not have been an expression of joy at all, but something darker. Something more like escape. You're standing in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. It's November 30th, 1876, and you're watching a man walk into a county office to do something that will humiliate him for the rest of his life. His name is Charles Ingalls. He's 40 years old. He has a wife and 4 daughters waiting at home, and he's about to sign a document admitting he's a failure. The paper in front of him requires him to swear under oath that he's completely destitute. Not struggling, not having a hard year, wholly without means, those are the actual words. Yeah, the government demands proof of total poverty before they'll give you anything, and Charles has to stand there and declare, officially, legally, that he cannot feed his own children. The county clerk slides the paper across the desk. Charles signs it. His handwriting is neat, controlled, the penmanship of a man who's been taught to write properly. There's no tremor in his signature. No visible sign of what this moment costs him. In exchange for his sworn statement of destitution, Charles receives 2 half barrels of flour, worth $5.25. That's what 3 years of fighting grasshoppers has reduced him to. $5 worth of flour, given as charity to a man who came west promising his wife stability and prosperity. He carries the flour home. He doesn't tell his daughters where it came from. Laura, 9 years old, will write 8 books about her father's pioneering adventures, and she'll never mention this moment, never mention the government relief, never mention her father standing in a county office, hat in hand, begging for help to feed his family. But it happened. The document exists. Charles Ingalls, the hero of Little House on the Prairie, accepted government welfare. And here's what makes that fact so important. It reveals everything Laura's books tried to hide, because the story you know, the story Laura told, is about a man who embodied self-reliance and frontier independence, a man who needed nothing from anyone, a man who could build a life anywhere with nothing but determination and a fiddle. The story the historical record tells is about a man who tried, a man who failed repeatedly and catastrophically, a man who relied on help he never acknowledged, a man whose restless moving wasn't adventure, it was desperation. And the distance between those 2 stories, between the myth and the man, reveals something crucial about American history. About how we tell stories about poverty and success. About who gets to be remembered as heroic and who gets forgotten as failed. About the lies we tell ourselves about the frontier, about self-reliance, about what it really took to survive when the government promised free land and delivered disaster. Laura Ingalls Wilder published Little House in the Big Woods in 1932 when she was 65 years old. She was writing during the Great Depression, when Americans were desperate for stories about people who'd survived hard times through grit and determination. She gave them her father. Transformed into a symbol of pioneer triumph, she left out the government relief. She left out the debts Charles couldn't pay. She left out the times they fled towns in the middle of the night because Charles owed money he didn't have. She left out her mother's quiet fury, the way Caroline must have watched her own siblings prosper, while Charles dragged her across the frontier chasing promises that never materialized. She left out the failure, and in doing so, she created a myth that millions of people believed, still believe. The myth of the noble pioneer, the self-made man, the father who provided for his family through nothing but hard work and virtue. Tonight, you're going to meet the real Charles Ingalls, The man Laura loved enough to lie about. The man whose story, told honestly, reveals more about American history than any myth ever could. You're going to learn why he couldn't stay in one place, what he was really running from, what the grasshopper plague actually did to families like his, what the fiddle meant when everything else was falling apart. You're going to see how the Homestead Act, sold as the solution to poverty, trapped families in cycles of debt and disaster they couldn't escape. How nearly half of all homesteaders failed and abandoned their claims. How environmental catastrophes like the 5-year grasshopper plague that destroyed 500,000 acres in Minnesota alone revealed the brutal truth. The frontier wasn't opportunity, it was a lottery most people lost. And you're going to understand why Laura chose to tell the story the way she did. Why the myth mattered more than the truth. Why America needed Pay Ingalls to be a hero, even if Charles Ingalls was something far more complicated. The man with the fiddle is waiting, and his real story is about to change everything you thought you knew about pioneer America. Let's start at the beginning, before Charles Ingalls became Pa, before failure became a pattern he couldn't break. January 10th, 1836. Charles Phillip Ingalls is born in Cuba, New York, into a family that can't sit still. His parents are farmers, but they're the restless kind, the kind who always believe the next place will be better. They move through New York, then Wisconsin, always searching for land that will finally give them security. Charles grows up learning that movement equals opportunity, that staying put means giving up. It's a lie, but it's a convincing one. And Charles believes it his entire life. He meets Caroline when he's in his 20s. She's 19, educated, working as a school teacher, one of the few women in 1850s Wisconsin who's earned her own money. She knows what it means to be poor. Her father drowned in Lake Michigan when she was 5, and she watched her mother struggle to keep 6 children alive through Wisconsin, winters that didn't forgive mistakes. Caroline learned something from her childhood that Charles never learned from his. Stability matters more than adventure. Staying put is how you survive. Moving is how you lose everything. On February 1st, 1860, Caroline marries Charles Ingalls. She's 20 years old. She's choosing to give up her teaching income, her independence, her hard-won stability, because Charles promises her a home and a future. What she's actually choosing, though she doesn't know it yet, is 42 years of watching Charles chase horizons, while she does the actual work of keeping their family alive. The first few years are good, relatively. They settle in Pepin County, Wisconsin, in the big woods. Charles and his brother and Caroline's brother build a log cabin 7 miles from town. It's isolated, surrounded by forests so dense that sunlight struggles to reach the ground, but it's theirs. They have land. They have a home. They have 2 daughters, Mary born in 1865 and Laura born in 1867. For a few years, Charles tries to stay. The cabin is solid. The farm produces. Caroline manages the garden, preserves food, makes all the family's clothing, does the invisible labour that makes frontier life possible. Charles hunts, farms, he works as a carpenter when needed, and in the evenings he plays his fiddle. Those songs Laura will later make famous, Arkansas Traveller and Money Musk and Pop Goes the Weasel. Laura will remember the big woods as magical. In her autobiography, Pioneer Girl, written decades later, she describes Wisconsin as the good time, the secure time, when they were so much better off there than we were everywhere else. That phrase tells you everything. Better off there than everywhere else, which means everywhere else was worse. Which means what came next was a decades-long descent from that brief period of stability. By 1868, Charles is restless. The big woods feel crowded to him, though by any objective measure 7 miles from the nearest neighbour is not crowded. But Charles hears stories from other men at church. He reads newspaper advertisements about land opening up in Kansas, listens to railroad companies promising free homesteads and instant prosperity under the new Homestead Act. The Homestead Act of 1862 is one of the most successful pieces of propaganda in American history. It promises 160 acres free to anyone willing to live on the land and farm it for 5 years. Free land. That's what they tell poor families in crowded eastern cities, and established farms in Wisconsin. Just move west. Just claim your 160 acres. Just prove it up, and it's yours forever. What they don't tell you, the 160 acres are too small to farm successfully in the arid West. The startup costs, tools, livestock, seed, building materials, run about $1,000, more than most families have. There's no guarantee of water, no guarantee the land is farmable. No help if drought or grasshoppers or blizzards destroy your crops. And if you fail, you lose everything, because you've sold whatever you had back east to pay for the move west. By 1900, nearly half of all homesteaders will have failed and abandoned their claims. But in 1868, Charles Ingalls doesn't know that. He believes the promise. He believes in free land and fresh starts and opportunity just over the horizon. So he makes a decision that will define the rest of his life and his family's life. He sells the Wisconsin property to a Swedish settler named Gustaf Gustafsson for $1,012.50. The payment will come in installments spread across years. Charles doesn't wait for the full amount. He takes his wife and 2 small daughters, loads everything they own into a wagon, and heads west. Caroline watches him pack the wagon. She doesn't argue. Arguing with Charles when he's decided something is like arguing with weather. It doesn't change anything and it only exhausts you. So she wraps the dishes and quilts, settles Mary and Laura in the wagon bed, and prepares to leave the only stable home she's had since her father died. She doesn't know yet that she'll spend the next 20 years moving, that she'll build homes and abandon them, plant gardens and leave them, make friends and lose them. That Charles's restlessness will become the defining fact of her life, the thing she can't escape and can't fix. All she knows right now is that they're leaving Wisconsin, leaving security, leaving the big woods where her daughters were born and her family prospered, and heading into something that Charles calls opportunity but will turn out to be something else entirely, something closer to catastrophe. It's 1869, and you're watching Charles Ingalls make the decision that will reveal who he really is. Not the decision to go to Kansas, that's already made, but the decision about where to settle once he gets there. The Osage Diminished Reserve in Kansas is not legally open to white settlement. The Osage people still own this land. The federal government is negotiating to take it from them, but treaties haven't been finalized. No surveys have been completed. No land has been officially opened for homesteading. But settlers are moving in anyway, squatting on land that doesn't belong to them, betting that the government will eventually evict the Osage and legitimize the illegal settlements. They call themselves pioneers. What they actually are is trespassers. Charles Ingalls becomes one of them. He knows the land isn't legally available. Everyone moving onto the Osage Reserve knows this. But there's a twisted logic operating here. A logic that defines much of American westward expansion. If you get there first and build something, even illegally, the government will probably let you keep it. Possession becomes 9/10 of the law, even when the law explicitly says you have no right to be there. So Charles builds. He finds a spot on the prairie, miles from any neighbours, and he builds a log cabin. Caroline, pregnant with their 3rd child, watches him work. The cabin rises log by log. It has a fireplace, a door, one window. It's small and rough, but it's shelter. Charles is proud of what he's built. What he's built is a home on stolen land, and deep down he knows it. When Laura writes about Kansas years later in Little House on the Prairie, she describes tension with the Osage people, describes her father's uneasiness, describes the family's eventual forced evacuation. She frames it as an unfortunate misunderstanding, a case of government policy changing unexpectedly. That's not what happened. What happened is that Charles knowingly squatted on tribal land, betting he could stay long enough for the government to steal it officially, and he lost that bet. But it gets worse. When the government surveys the Kansas land in 1871, they discover something that makes Charles's situation even more precarious. The spot where he built his cabin isn't just on the Osage Reserve. It's on a designated school section, land set aside to be sold at $3 per acre to fund public schools, not available for homesteading at all. Charles has spent 2 years building on land he can never legally own, in 2 different ways. He's squatting on tribal land, and he's squatting on a school section. There is no legal path forward. He has to leave. Laura's books say they left because the government made them. That's true, but it obscures the larger truth. Charles chose to build on land he had no right to claim. He gambled that it would work out. He lost, and his wife and 3 daughters paid the price. In 1871, the Ingalls family loads the wagon again. Mary is 6. Laura is 4. Carrie, born in Kansas, is less than 2 years old. They leave the cabin Charles built, leave the land Caroline worked to turn into a garden, and head back east. They return to Wisconsin, to the exact same property they left 3 years earlier. Because Gustav Gustafsson, the Swedish settler who bought their farm, couldn't make the installment payments, the sale fell through. The land is still legally Charles's, and now, having failed in Kansas, he's returning to the home he should never have left. This is the pattern that will define Charles Ingalls' life. Movement sold as ambition, but functioning as escape. Restlessness framed as adventure, but revealing itself as instability. Decisions that put his family at risk while he chases dreams that evaporate as soon as he reaches for them. Caroline watches him unload the wagon at the Wisconsin cabin they left 3 years ago. Nothing has changed except time, except Mary and Laura are 3 years older, except they've lost 3 years of stability, 3 years of community, 3 years that could have been spent building something permanent, and Charles can't sit still. You can see it in what happens next. Even with the Kansas failure fresh, even back in the same Wisconsin cabin where they started, Charles is already looking west again, already reading newspapers about new land opening up, already talking about fresh starts and better opportunities and how this time will be different. Caroline doesn't argue. She's learned something about her husband in the 11 years since their wedding. He will never stop moving. The restlessness isn't circumstantial, it's fundamental. It's who he is, and she's married to it, legally and permanently, in an era when women have almost no power to refuse their husbands' decisions. So when Charles announces in 1874 that they're moving to Minnesota, to a place called Walnut Grove where land is available near Plum Creek, Caroline packs again. She loads the dishes again. She prepares the girls again. She leaves Wisconsin again, this time knowing they probably won't come back. The pattern is set now. The restlessness has become the defining fact of the family's life, and what's waiting for them in Minnesota is going to make everything that came before look easy. Because on June 12th, 1873, a year before Charles even files his claim in Minnesota, something happens in the southwestern part of the state that will change everything. Farmers working their fields see what looks like a snowstorm approaching from the west. The sky darkens. The air fills with a sound like thunder, like a train, like something massive and unstoppable bearing down on them, and then they see what it actually is. Grasshoppers. Not hundreds, not thousands, trillions. Rocky Mountain locusts descending in a cloud so thick it blocks the sun. In a matter of hours, they devour entire fields of wheat. They eat the crops down to bare ground. They eat the leaves off trees. They eat leather, fabric, tool handles. They eat everything organic they can reach, and then they lay eggs in the soil, billions and billions of eggs that will hatch next spring and do it all again. It's the beginning of a 5-year plague that will destroy 500,000 acres of crops, bankrupt thousands of farmers, and reveal the brutal truth about frontier life. When disaster strikes, self-reliance is a myth, and the government's promise of free land becomes a trap you can't escape. Charles Ingalls files his claim on June 26, 1874, on 172 acres near Plum Creek in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. He has no idea what's coming, but the grasshoppers are already there, and they're waiting. Charles Ingalls files his homestead claim on June 26, 1874, on 172 acres near Plum Creek in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. He's standing in the land office signing papers that make this land officially his, at least for now. In 5 years, if he builds a house and farms the land and stays put, it'll be his forever. Free. That's the promise of the Homestead Act. That's what brought him here. The clerk hands him the receipt. Charles walks out into the summer sunshine feeling something he hasn't felt in years. Hope. Real hope. He's got good land this time. A rich black soil, A creek running through it. Neighbours close enough to help if needed, but far enough to give him space. He's learned from Kansas. He's learned from the failed Missouri Purchase. This time, he tells himself, this time it's going to work. He doesn't know that the disaster already started a year ago, 70 miles southwest of where he's standing. He doesn't know that what happened on June 12th, 1873, is about to happen again, and again, and again for the next 4 years. He doesn't know that the grasshoppers are coming. Let's back up 1 year. To understand what's waiting for Charles, you need to see what hit Minnesota in 1873, before he even filed his claim. It's June 12th, 1873. You're a farmer in southwestern Minnesota, working your wheat field on a day so clear and bright it feels like a promise. The wheat is coming up strong, the weather's been good. You're calculating yield in your head, estimating how much you'll make when you sell at harvest, planning how you'll use that money to pay off the tools you bought on credit, maybe buy a cow, maybe build an addition to the cabin. Then you hear something, a sound like wind, like distant thunder, like a train approaching, except there's no railroad within 20 miles of here. You look up, and the western horizon is dark. Not storm clouds, something else, something moving, something that covers the sky from north to south as far as you can see. A living cloud that's getting closer, and the sound is getting louder, and now you can see what it is. Grasshoppers. Trillions of them. Rocky Mountain locusts, technically, though nobody calls them that. They call them grasshoppers. Hi, and they're descending on your wheat field in numbers that make your brain refuse to process what your eyes are seeing. The sky goes dark. The sun disappears. The sound is deafening. Millions of wings beating. Millions of bodies hitting each other, hitting the ground, hitting you. They land in your hair. They land on your face. They land on your wheat, and they start eating. Not just eating, devouring. In minutes, stalks of wheat that took months to grow are gone. The grasshoppers eat everything green. They eat the wheat down to stubble. They eat the leaves off trees. They eat the vegetables in your garden. They eat your wife's cotton apron hanging on the line. They eat the leather off your plough handles. They eat the wool from the sheep if you're not fast enough to get them under cover. You try to fight them. Everyone tries. You light fires. You beat them with sticks. You try to sweep them away. It's like trying to fight the ocean. For every 1,000 you kill, 10,000 more arrive. The ground is so thick with them you can't see the dirt. When you walk, you crunch through layers of bodies. It lasts for hours, sometimes days. They eat everything. And then, as suddenly as they arrived, they leave. They fly away toward the east, leaving behind a landscape that looks like it's been burned, every field stripped, every tree bare, every farm ruined. But before they leave, they do something worse than eating your crops. They lay eggs, billions and billions of eggs, deep in the soil. Each female can lay up to 30 pods, each pod containing up to 30 eggs. The math is impossible to calculate, but it means this. Next spring, when the eggs hatch, the grasshoppers will come back, not from the west this time, from underground, from your own fields, from the soil you thought was yours. The 1873 infestation destroys crops across 40 Minnesota counties. Thousands of farmers lose everything. Some leave immediately, abandoning claims they worked years to establish. Others stay, hoping it's over, hoping it was a freak event that won't happen again. They're wrong. That's the Minnesota Charles Ingalls is moving into in 1874. He files his claim in June, right after the worst of the breeding season, right when eggs are buried everywhere. By the time he builds his house and ploughs his first field and plants his first crop, the eggs have been underground for months waiting for spring. Charles has no idea. He ploughs the soil. He plants wheat. He watches it grow through the summer of 1874 and he's happy. The crop looks good. The weather's cooperating. Caroline plants a garden. The girls play in the creek. They have neighbours, the Nelsons, the Stedmans, other families trying to make it work. For a few months it feels like they've finally found stability. Then, in late summer 1874, the grasshoppers return. Both the newly hatched ones from underground and new swarms from the west. And they destroy everything. again. Charles stands in his field watching his first crop disappear. He's 40 years old. He's moved his family 6 times already. He's filed a homestead claim that requires him to stay for 5 years to prove ownership. And now the crop that was supposed to feed his family and pay his debts is being eaten by insects he has no way to stop. This is when Charles starts to understand what he's really facing. Not a bad year, not a single disaster, a cycle, a plague that returns every single year, making farming impossible, turning the Homestead Act's promise of free land into a trap, because you can't leave. If you leave before 5 years, you lose the claim. You lose everything you've built. But if you stay, the grasshoppers will destroy your crops every year, and you'll go deeper and deeper into debt until you're bankrupt anyway. Charles Ingalls, the man who moved his family west, chasing the promise of free land and independence, is about to learn what happens when that promise turns into a cage you can't escape. Here's what nobody tells you about surviving a 5-year agricultural disaster. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like drowning in slow motion. Charles plants wheat in spring 1875. The grasshoppers destroy it. He plants in spring 1876. They destroy it again. He plants in 1877. Same result. Every year the pattern repeats. The eggs hatch in May or June. The nymphs eat everything within reach. New swarms arrive from the west, adding to the destruction. By late summer, there's no crop, no harvest, no income, no way forward except more debt. The Homestead Act requirements don't care about grasshoppers. Charles still has to stay on the land, still has to make improvements, still has to survive somehow, even with no income, no crops, and debt accumulating like snow in a blizzard. So he does what frontier farmers do when crops fail. He leaves his family and finds work. Railroad construction is booming in Minnesota in the 1870s. Companies need labourers to grade tracks, lay ties, drive spikes. The pay is terrible. $1 a day, maybe $1.50 if you're skilled. But it's cash, and cash means food, and food means his daughters don't starve. Charles takes the work. He walks away from his homestead, leaving Caroline alone with Mary, Laura, Carrie and baby Grace, born May 23rd, 1877, right in the middle of the worst grasshopper years. He walks away from the house he built and the land he claimed, and he works as a day labourer on someone else's railroad. This is the reality Laura's books don't tell. Pa Ingalls, the skilled carpenter and hunter and fiddler, reduced to manual labour. Leaving his wife to manage 4 children alone in a house where grasshoppers have eaten even the curtains. Coming home exhausted. With just enough money to buy flour and beans, then leaving again because the money runs out and there's no choice. Caroline watches him go. She's 37 years old in 1876. She's been married 16 years. She's moved 6 times. She's had 4 daughters, and she's pregnant with a 5th child who'll be born into this disaster. And now her husband is walking away again, not to chase some horizon this time, but just to earn enough to keep them alive. She does what she's always done. She works. She keeps the house. She tends the garden, what's left of it after the grasshoppers. She teaches Mary and Laura to read and write, because education is the one thing grasshoppers can't destroy. She makes every pound of flour stretch further than it should. She tells the girls that Pa's coming back, that things will get better, that they just have to hold on a little longer. And when the flour runs out, when the beans run out, when there's genuinely nothing left, she sends Charles to the county office to sign that document we talked about in Chapter 1, the one dated November 30th, 1876, the one that declares him wholly without means, the one that gets them 2 half barrels of flour worth $5.25. Government relief during the grasshopper years isn't unusual. By 1876, the disaster is so widespread that Minnesota's governor issues emergency aid. The state distributes seed grain, flour, and basic supplies to thousands of destitute farmers. 40 counties are affected. The economic damage runs into millions of dollars. It's one of the worst agricultural catastrophes in American history. But accepting relief means admitting failure. It means standing in a public office and swearing, officially and legally, that you cannot provide for your family. For a man like Charles, who spent his entire adult life believing in self-reliance and frontier independence, it's humiliating. He signs the document anyway. because pride doesn't feed children, and his daughters are hungry. Here's what makes this moment so important. Charles Ingalls isn't weak or lazy or incompetent. He's working as hard as humanly possible. He's taking any job available. He's doing everything the frontier mythology says a man should do. Work hard, stay determined, don't give up. And it's not enough. Because the problem isn't Charles. The problem is structural. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres free, but it didn't account for grasshopper plagues or drought or blizzards or the 100 other environmental disasters that could destroy a crop. The government advertised the frontier as opportunity, but it didn't provide insurance or market access or any safety net for when disaster struck. So families like the Ingalls got trapped. They couldn't leave without losing their claim. They couldn't stay without going bankrupt. The so-called free land became a trap that cost everything. Charles isn't unique in this. All across Minnesota, families are making the same impossible choice. Some stay and starve. Some leave and lose their claims. Some send their husbands and fathers away to work, breaking up families just to survive another season. Some turn to the government relief they've been told their whole lives represents failure and shame. By 1877, the grasshopper plague has been going for 5 years. Farmers are bankrupted by the thousands. Land that was claimed and partially improved sits abandoned because people simply can't survive there anymore. The Homestead Act's promise of populating the frontier with small farmers is collapsing under the weight of environmental reality, and Charles Ingalls, standing in his stripped wheat field for the 5th year in a row, watching grasshoppers eat his future again, finally breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically. He just accepts the truth he's been denying since Kansas, since Missouri, since he left Wisconsin chasing promises that were always lies. He can't make this work. He can't win. The frontier is an opportunity. Then it's a grinding machine that takes everything you have and gives nothing back except exhaustion and debt and failure. So he makes a decision that will define the next phase of his life. He's going to leave Minnesota. He's going to abandon the homestead he filed in 1874 before he ever proves it up. He's going to walk away from another claim, another house, another attempt at stability, and he's going to take his family somewhere even more desperate, somewhere that doesn't remind him every day of what he failed to build, somewhere he can pretend, at least for a little while, that he's starting fresh instead of running away. The grasshoppers finally leave Minnesota in 1877. The Rocky Mountain locust species will go extinct within a few decades, wiped out by changes in their breeding habitat. But by then, it's too late for Charles. The damage is done. The man who came to Minnesota hoping to prove up a homestead is leaving as a failure. Again. It's 1876, and you need to understand what failure looks like from the inside. From the outside, you might think Charles and Caroline are doing fine. They have a house. They have food sometimes. They haven't died. The girls are healthy. That's success on the frontier, isn't it? Just surviving. But survival isn't the same as living. And Charles knows the difference. He's 40 years old. He's been married 16 years. He's moved his family 7 times. He's filed homestead claims he couldn't complete. He's left towns owing money he'll never pay back. He's taken government relief. Yeah, he's watched his wife's family stay in Wisconsin and prosper, while he dragged Caroline across the frontier chasing dreams that dissolved the moment he touched them. And every evening, when the work is done and the girls are fed, and Caroline is doing the 100 tasks that never end, Charles picks up his fiddle. He plays Arkansas Traveler, he plays Money Musk, he plays Pop Goes the Weasel, and Mary and Laura dance. And for a few minutes the cabin fills with music and movement and something that almost feels like joy. But here's the question historians have started asking. What was the fiddle actually doing for Charles? Laura's books present the music as celebration. Pa playing his fiddle because he's happy. Because pioneer life, for all its hardships, is fundamentally good. Because there's joy in the simple things. Family, music, a warm fire. Carolyn Fraser, in her Pulitzer Prize-winning biography Prairie Fires, suggests something darker. What if the fiddle wasn't celebration? What if it was escape? What if Charles played music because it was the only time he didn't have to think about the debts piling up, the crops failing, the fact that his brother-in-law Peter Quiner stayed in Wisconsin, and now owns a prosperous farm while Charles is signing documents swearing he's destitute. Music is a powerful psychological escape. It creates a space where you don't have to face reality, where you can feel competent and skilled and valuable, where you can be the man you wanted to be instead of the man you actually are. Charles Ingalls is a good fiddler, maybe the best in the county. People request him at dances, they compliment his playing, and for a man who's failing at everything else, farming, providing, building stability, that matters. That might be the only thing keeping him from completely falling apart. But Caroline isn't escaping. She can't. While Charles plays the fiddle, she's mending clothes or churning butter, or calculating how to make the flour last until Charles comes back from his next railroad job with more money. She's carrying the actual weight of keeping the family alive, and she's watching her husband retreat further and further into restlessness. Even before the grasshoppers, even in the good years, Charles couldn't settle. Now, with the weight of repeated failure pressing down on him, he's becoming someone Caroline barely recognizes. Someone who talks about leaving, about fresh starts, about how the next place will be different. He's talking about Iowa, about a town called Burr Oak where there's a hotel for sale. Not a homestead this time. That failed. Not farming. The grasshoppers destroyed that. But running a hotel, managing other people's property, doing work that doesn't depend on weather or insects or the 100 variables that ruined every other plan. Caroline listens, and she knows what this means. It means Charles is giving up on the Minnesota claim, walking away before proving up, losing 3 years of work and suffering because he can't face another season of hoping the grasshoppers won't come back. It means moving again, packing again, explaining to Mary and Laura again why they're leaving another home, why they can't stay with the friends they've made, why Pa's decision matters more than their stability, and there's nothing she can say that will change his mind, because Charles has already decided. In his mind, he's already left. The fiddle music isn't joy anymore, it's a countdown. The last few songs before he loads the wagon and disappears from another place where he failed. In 1877, the Ingalls family leaves Walnut Grove. They move to Burr Oak, Iowa, where Charles and Caroline help run a hotel called the Masters Hotel. It's not the life Charles imagined when he married Caroline. It's not the homestead with 160 acres and independence and self-sufficiency. It's wage labour. It's working for someone else. It's every dream he had shrunk down to the size of rented rooms and other people's laundry. Laura will barely write about Burr Oak in her books. She'll skip from Minnesota to Dakota territory, erasing an entire year as if it didn't happen. And maybe that tells you everything. Maybe Burr Oak is so much of a failure, so far from the frontier triumph narrative she's building, that she can't include it without destroying the myth. But it happened. Charles and Caroline worked in that hotel. They took wages. They lived in spaces that weren't theirs. They gave up the dream of land ownership, at least temporarily, because the dream had been destroyed by grasshoppers and debt, and the brutal reality that the Homestead Act's promise was always a lie. The grasshopper plague ends in 1877. The Rocky Mountain locusts move on, their populations collapsing for reasons scientists still don't fully understand. The Minnesota fields recover. New farmers move in, and are taking over the abandoned claims. Some of the families who stayed eventually prove up their homesteads, but the Ingalls family isn't there to see it. They're in Iowa, working for wages, living in someone else's building, trying to forget what happened in Minnesota, trying to forget the 5 years of hoping and failing and watching the sky turn black with insects that ate everything they built. Charles plays his fiddle, Caroline manages the hotel, Mary and Laura grow older. And somewhere deep inside Charles, the restlessness is building again. The urge to move, to try again, to find a place where the past doesn't follow and failure doesn't define him. He doesn't know yet that place doesn't exist, that failure isn't geographic, it's structural, that the problem was never him choosing the wrong location. The problem was the system that promised free land and delivered disaster. That sold self-reliance and delivered dependence. That turned frontier settlement into a lottery where almost everyone lost. But he'll figure it out eventually. In a few years, in Dakota territory, when he finally proves up a homestead and discovers that land ownership doesn't fix the fundamental problem. that economic security on the frontier is a myth for people like him, that no amount of moving will change the fact that the American dream, for small farmers in the late 1800s, was propaganda covering up structural inequality. For now, though, Charles is in Iowa, playing his fiddle, pretending the music means something other than escape, and preparing, without quite admitting it, to move again. The fiddle is still playing in Burr Oak, Iowa. But Charles isn't listening to his own music anymore. It's 1878, and he's 42 years old, working in someone else's hotel, living in rooms that aren't his, watching other people's money change hands while he earns wages that barely cover food. This wasn't supposed to be his life. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres and independence. What he got was debt, disaster, and the kind of failure that follows you no matter how far you run. Caroline watches him at night after the hotel work is done. She knows that look. The restlessness building behind his eyes. The way he listens too carefully when travellers talk about opportunities further west. The way he mentions Dakota territory like it's a prayer instead of a place. She doesn't want to move again. She's 39 years old. She has 4 daughters, Mary at 13, Laura at 11, Carrie at 9, and Grace barely a year old. She's exhausted. She's done with starting over, with packing wagons, with building new lives in places that Charles will inevitably abandon when the restlessness wins. But Charles has already decided. And Caroline, after 18 years of marriage, knows there's no point arguing. So when Charles announces in early 1879 that they're moving to Dakota territory, to a town called De Smet that doesn't really exist yet, Caroline packs her things. Again. This time is different, though. Charles has learned something from Minnesota, from the grasshopper years, from watching his crops get devoured 5 summers in a row. He's learned that farming alone is suicide. That weather and insects and 100 variables you can't control will destroy you if you depend entirely on the land. So he's not just moving to Homestead this time, he's moving for a job. The Chicago and Northwestern Railroad is pushing west through Dakota territory, and they need workers. They need carpenters to build stations, graders to level roadbeds, men who can work with their hands and aren't afraid of hard labour. Charles can do all of that. He's good at it, actually, better at carpentry than farming if he's honest. The railroad offers something crops never did. Guaranteed pay. $1 a day, sometimes more for skilled work. It's not much, but it's predictable. Grasshoppers can't eat railroad wages, drought can't destroy them. Charles can work for the railroad, earn steady money, and use that financial cushion to file a homestead claim on the side. Maybe this time, with wage income to fall back on, he can actually prove up a claim. It's the smartest decision Charles has made in a decade, and he doesn't quite realise it yet. The family arrives in De Smet in the fall of 1879. There is no town. Not really. There's a surveyor's house where the railroad keeps equipment and housing for workers. There's a railroad depot under construction. There are a few other families, other railroad workers and speculators who've arrived early to stake claims before the land rush. The landscape is nothing like Wisconsin's forests or even Kansas's prairie. This is open country in a way that feels almost violent. Grass stretching to every horizon, sky so big it makes you feel small, wind that never stops. I'm bending the grass in waves that look like an ocean frozen mid-motion. In winter, that wind will be deadly. But right now, in the full warmth, it just feels like possibility. Charles settles his family into the surveyor's house. It's temporary housing provided by the railroad. One room where 7 people, Charles, Caroline, Mary, Laura, Carrie, Grace, and sometimes boarders, the family takes in for extra income, live together through the winter. It's cramped and loud and nothing like the independence Charles promised, but it's shelter. And in February 1880, on the 19th day of the month, Charles walks into the land office in Brookings, Dakota Territory, and files his homestead claim. The paperwork is official, typed, recorded in the massive ledgers the federal government keeps. Section 3, Township 110 North, Range 56 West, Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory. The claim covers 154.2 acres. The government records say exactly 154.209 acres, measured precisely. Charles signs his name. He swears under oath, I am the head of a family consisting of a wife and 4 children and a citizen of the United States. The names of his wife and children aren't listed. Caroline's name isn't recorded. Mary, Laura, Carrie, and Grace exist in the paperwork only as numbers. 4 children. They're legal dependents, justification for Charles's claim, but not people worth naming. That detail tells you everything about how the Homestead Act viewed families. Charles is the claimant. The land is his. The women and children are just supporting evidence that he qualifies. But Charles doesn't care about the bureaucratic indifference right now. He's holding papers that make him, officially and legally, a homesteader. Again. For what he swears will be the last time. He's 44 years old. He's filed claims before, in Kansas, in Minnesota, and abandoned them. But this time feels different. He has the railroad job. He has steady income. He has Caroline, who's made it quietly but firmly clear that she's done moving, that if Charles wants his family intact, De Smet is where they're staying. Charles walks out of the land office in Brookings with his homestead receipt. The Dakota sky is enormous above him, cloudless and blue. The wind is cold but not brutal yet. Spring is coming. He'll build a house on his claim. He'll plant crops, but he won't depend on them. He'll keep working for the railroad. He'll prove up this claim if it kills him. He doesn't know yet that proving up a homestead is the easy part, that surviving the next 6 years will require enduring a catastrophe that makes the grasshopper plague look merciful. He doesn't know that in just 7 months the weather will try to murder his entire family, and unlike the grasshoppers, which took crops and pride, this disaster will take everything. October 15th, 1880. The blizzard hits De Smet with 3 days of snow so thick you can't see 10 feet in front of you. It's early. Too early for winter storms. This is supposed to be fall, harvest time, when you finish outdoor work before the real cold arrives. But the temperature drops 40 degrees in hours. Wind screams across the prairie at speeds that knock grown men off their feet. Sostor. Snow falls so fast and thick that it doesn't look like weather anymore. It looks like the sky collapsing. Charles is in town when it starts. He's working on a building, one of the 16 structures that went up on De Smet's town site during that first summer. He looks up at the darkening sky, feels the temperature plummet, and starts running for the homestead where Caroline and the girls are waiting. He barely makes it. The wind is already strong enough to disorient him. Snow fills his eyes, his mouth, his lungs when he breathes. He follows the direction he knows the claim sits, praying he doesn't walk past it in the whiteout, and finds the shanty just as visibility drops to nothing. Caroline has the girls inside. Mary, Laura, Carrie, Grace. They're safe for now. But the house Charles built over the summer, 14 feet by 20 feet, frame construction, basic but solid, is shaking in the wind. Snow finds every gap, every crack, dusting the floor inside even with the door shut. The blizzard lasts 3 days. When it finally stops and Charles can see again, the landscape has changed. Snow drifts 20 feet high in places. The railroad tracks are buried. The road to town is invisible, and everyone realizes this isn't weather. It's a siege. The winter of 1880 to 1881 will become legendary. Settlers will call it the hard winter or the long winter, and decades later, Laura will write an entire book about it, the most harrowing of all her Little House stories, the one where survival isn't guaranteed and hope becomes a luxury they can't afford. Here's what happens. The blizzards don't stop. They come every few days, sometimes every few weeks, sometimes back to back with barely time to dig out between storms. Each one dumps more snow, each one drives the temperature down further. By December, the trains stop running. The Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, the lifeline bringing coal and food and kerosene to every town along the line, gets blocked by snowdrifts so massive that snowplows can't move them. The railroad cuts, those excavated trenches where the tracks run through higher ground, fill with snow packed so hard it turns into ice, 20 feet deep in places, mixed with dirt blown from the prairie, making it even harder and heavier. Men with pickaxes work for weeks trying to clear it, and they make almost no progress. De Smet is cut off. No trains mean no supplies. The coal runs out first, then the kerosene for lamps, then the food. Charles and Caroline burn hay for heat. Twisted into tight sticks, hay burns fast and gives off less warmth than wood or coal, but it's what they have. The smell fills the house, smoke and char and the acrid bite of burning grass. It's better than freezing, barely. The food situation gets desperate. The merchants in town had small stockpiles, but those disappear within weeks. Families that came west with almost nothing find themselves with literally nothing. Some survive on wheat ground in coffee mills, eating the coarse flour raw or boiled into a paste. Charles, Caroline, and the girls eat potatoes when they have them. Bread made from their stored wheat. Eventually just the wheat itself, ground painstakingly by hand, cooked into a porridge that's barely edible but keeps you alive. Laura will later describe her father walking to the homestead of another settler to buy seed wheat. Wheat that was supposed to be planted in spring but becomes food instead because there is nothing else. She'll describe the satisfaction of finally having bread again, even rough bread that's more grit than flour. But she won't describe, at least not fully, the fear. The knowledge that every storm could be the one that finally kills them. That if the trains don't come soon, the food will run out completely and then it's just a question of who dies first. The elderly, the children, the sick, the unlucky. Charles keeps working when he can, between storms. He twists hay into fuel. He grinds wheat. He walks into town during clear days to check on supplies to see if the trains might break through, to get news that never comes. Caroline rations food with precision that borders on cruelty. Smaller portions every week, cutting meals when the stores get too low. Teaching the girls to make do with less, to stop complaining about hunger, to understand that survival means suffering now so you're alive later. The winter doesn't break until April, 7 months from October through April, with trains blocked from late December until early May. 7 months of storms and cold and slow starvation. When the first train finally breaks through in May 1881, the entire town turns out to watch. Grown men cry. Women stand in the street staring at the locomotive like it's a miracle, which it is. The train brings food, coal, news from the outside world. It brings proof that they're not abandoned, that the rest of the country still exists, that winter can end. Charles Ingalls stands with his wife and daughters watching the train. He's 45 years old. He's survived the grasshopper plague and now the hard winter. He's lost crops to insects and nearly lost his family to cold and starvation. He hasn't proved up his homestead yet, that's still years away, but he's still here. That has to count for something. May 1886. Charles Ingalls walks into the land office in Brookings for the last time. He's 50 years old. It's been 6 years since he filed his homestead claim. 6 years of living on that 154-acre plot near De Smet, building improvements, farming the land, surviving winters and summers and the endless work that frontier life demands. Today he's proving up. Filing his final testimony, the paperwork that transfers ownership of the land from the federal government to him, officially and permanently. The clerk asks him to describe his improvements. Charles testifies that he's built a 14 by 20 foot house with a 1-story 12 by 16 foot addition, that he's built a 16 by 24 foot frame barn, larger than the original house, which tells you what frontier priorities actually are, that he's planted apple and plum trees, that the total value of his homestead is about $1,000. The clerk writes it all down. Charles signs the papers. After 6 years, the land is his. By every legal measure, Charles Ingalls has succeeded. He's completed what more than half of homesteaders fail to do. He's actually proved up a claim. He owns land. He has a deed with his name on it. Yeah, he's achieved the dream that brought his family west. But here's what that success feels like. Exhaustion. Financial precarity. The knowledge that land ownership doesn't solve poverty when the land barely produces enough to survive on. Because Charles isn't farming anymore, not really. By 1886 he's working odd jobs in town. Carpentry, hauling, whatever pays. The homestead exists, the legal claim is complete, but it's not providing income. It's not making him prosperous. It's just land. In 1880, Charles built a small store on a lot in De Smet's town centre. He sold general goods, tried to make it work as a business. It closed within a year. The records valued the property at $160 in 1885. Charles sold it that October for $600, using the money to improve the homestead and buy a residential lot on 3rd Street in town. In the fall of 1887, Charles builds a house on that 3rd Street lot. Not on the homestead, in town. A proper house with real construction, the kind of building that says you've given up on farming as your primary livelihood. The family moves to the 3rd Street house in December 1887. Caroline, Mary, Laura, Carrie and Grace leave the homestead behind. They sell the homestead property in 1892, 5 years after moving to town, finally cutting the legal tie to the land Charles spent 6 years proving up. What does that tell you? That even when Charles succeeded at homesteading, even when he legally owned 154 acres of Dakota territory, it wasn't enough. The land didn't make him prosperous. Farming didn't provide security. The Homestead Act's promise, 160 acres and independence, turned out to be exactly what historians now recognise it as. Propaganda that masks structural inequality. Charles lives the last 15 years of his life in De Smet. He works odd jobs. He serves as Justice of the Peace, an elected position that gives him some respect but minimal income. He's an active member of the First Congregational Church, one of the 8 original charter members when the church building opens in August 1882. He plays his fiddle, at dances, at church socials, at home for his family. The music is still there, the one constant through decades of moving and failing and trying again. But the restlessness is gone, or maybe it's not gone. Maybe Caroline has just won. She insisted they stay in De Smet, that the girls needed stability, education, a community. That Charles had dragged them across enough states and they were done moving. Charles stops fighting it. Maybe he's too tired. Maybe he's finally accepted that movement won't solve his problems. Maybe he looks at his brother-in-law Peter, still prosperous in Wisconsin after never leaving, and realises that staying put was always the smarter choice. On June 8th, 1902, Charles Phillip Ingalls dies in the 3rd Street house. He's 66 years old. The cause of death is listed as cardiovascular disease, heart failure after an illness of several weeks. His obituary calls him honest and upright. The community respects him. He's given Masonic rites at his funeral, buried in De Smet Cemetery, alongside the family that survived everything with him. The obituary doesn't mention the moves. It doesn't mention Kansas or the grasshopper plague or the government relief. It doesn't mention that Charles filed homestead claims he couldn't complete, that he left towns owing debts, that he spent 20 years chasing stability he never found until he stopped chasing. It's a kind obituary. The kind you write for a man whose real story is too complicated for a newspaper column. The kind that focuses on his final years, respected citizen, church member, justice of the peace, and ignores the decades of failure that came before. Laura will eventually write 8 books that transform her father into a hero. Pa Ingalls, with his fiddle and his optimism, building homes and surviving disasters and teaching his daughters that hard work and determination can overcome anything. The real Charles Ingalls survived, yes, but he didn't overcome. He endured. He moved when systems failed him. He took government relief when pride wouldn't feed his children. He worked railroad jobs and carpentry and anything that paid because farming, the thing the Homestead Act promised would make him independent, wasn't enough. His story isn't about triumph. It's about what happens when structural inequality meets environmental catastrophe and individual effort isn't enough. It's about how the American frontier wasn't opportunity for small farmers. It was a lottery most people lost. But here's what Charles did accomplish. He kept his family together. Through grasshoppers and blizzards and poverty that had them signing documents, swearing they were destitute, Charles and Caroline kept Mary, Laura, Carrie and Grace alive. They gave them education. They gave them community. They gave them enough stability eventually to build their own lives. Laura became a writer. She transformed her father's failures into America's most beloved pioneer story. She turned Charles's restlessness into adventure, his poverty into noble simplicity, his desperation into determination. She loved him enough to lie about him. Or maybe she loved him enough to tell the truth that mattered more than facts, that he tried, that he kept playing the fiddle even when everything else was falling apart, that he survived long enough for his daughters to remember him as something other than a failure. Charles Ingalls died in 1902. The Little House books were published starting in 1932, 30 years after his death. He never knew he'd become famous, never knew millions of people would read about Pa Ingalls and see a hero. Maybe that's better. Maybe Charles wouldn't want people to know how hard it really was, how close they came to losing everything, over and over, how the fiddle wasn't always joy. Sometimes it was just the sound of a man trying to escape the weight of his own choices. The man who couldn't stay in one place is buried in De Smet, South Dakota, in a grave that hasn't moved in 124 years. The restless farmer finally stopped, and his daughter made sure the world remembered him not as he was, but as he wanted to be. That might be the greatest gift a child can give a parent, transforming their failures into myths worth believing. Charles Ingalls gets his name on the Homestead papers. The land records list him as the claimant, the head of household, the man who built the houses and ploughed the fields and proved up the claim. Caroline Lake. Quinn Ingalls doesn't appear in those records. Her name isn't on the deed. The land office paperwork lists her only as wife, one of 4 dependents Charles claimed when filing, alongside their daughters Mary, Laura, Carrie and Grace. That legal invisibility tells you everything about how frontier settlement viewed women's work. Charles's labour, building, ploughing, planting, was documented, measured, recorded as proof of homestead improvements. Caroline's labour, the work that actually kept the family alive through 20 years of moving and failing and trying again, was invisible. So let's make it visible. Here's what Caroline did every single day, starting before dawn and ending long after dark. She woke first, always, because the fire had to be restarted before anyone else got up. Frontier houses didn't stay warm overnight. The fire burned down to coals, and every morning someone had to blow those coals back to flame, add kindling, get the heat going so the house wasn't freezing when the children woke. That someone was always Caroline. She cooked 3 meals a day from scratch, over that fire using ingredients that were never guaranteed. Bread from flour she'd ground herself. Meat from animals Charles killed, but Caroline butchered, salted, smoked, preserved. Vegetables from a garden she planted, weeded, harvested and processed into forms that would last through winter. Canned, pickled, dried. She made every piece of clothing the family wore. All of it. From spinning wool or weaving flax to cutting patterns to sewing by hand. Mary needs a dress. Laura needs stockings. Carrie outgrows her shoes and needs new ones made from leather. Caroline has tanned herself. Grace is born in 1877, right in the middle of the grasshopper plague, and needs everything babies need. Diapers, blankets, clothes, all produced by Caroline's hands. She managed water. In most of the places the Ingalls lived, there was no well initially. Caroline carried water from creeks or rivers, bucket by bucket for drinking, cooking, washing. A bucket of water weighs about 20 pounds. Caroline needed dozens of buckets per day. Do the math on how much weight she carried just to keep her family hydrated and clean. She did laundry, which in the 1870s was a multi-day process. Hauling water, heating it, scrubbing clothes by hand, boiling them in lye soap she'd made herself from animal fat and ashes, rinsing them, wringing them, hanging them to dry, ironing them with heavy flat irons heated on the stove. One load of laundry took days. She bore children and nursed them. 4 daughters over 12 years, each pregnancy carrying risks that killed thousands of women her age. She taught those children to read and write before there were schools, because education was the one thing grasshoppers and blizzards couldn't destroy. And she did all of this while Charles was gone, which was often. During the grasshopper years, Charles worked railroad jobs that took him away for weeks at a time. Caroline managed the household alone, with 4 young children, in houses that were barely shelters, with resources that were constantly running out. Here's the part that matters. None of this was called work. It was just what women did. It was invisible, uncompensated, taken for granted. Charles could point to a house and say, "I built that." He could point to a ploughed field and say, "I did that." His labour produced visible results that the Homestead Act recognised as improvements. Caroline's labour kept everyone alive long enough to see those improvements, but it didn't count. Not legally, not economically, not in the stories people told about frontier success. And here's what makes it worse. The real Caroline was even tougher than Laura's books admitted. Because Laura sanitised her mother for publication, making Ma into a genteel woman who stayed in the house and disapproved of rough work. The real Caroline Ingalls went into the fields herself to help with haying when they needed extra hands. She worked in the Masters Hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa, alongside her daughters Mary and Laura, after doing paid labour to keep the family from starving. She did whatever needed doing, because survival didn't respect gender roles and neither did poverty. Laura couldn't write that version of her mother. Not in 1932, when the Little House books were published and middle-class American readers wanted to believe frontier women were delicate and protected. So Laura turned Caroline into Ma, always proper, always disapproving of Laura working outside the home, always confined to domestic space. The real Caroline worked, constantly, in ways that broke her body and exhausted her mind but kept her family alive through disasters that killed thousands of other families. And she did it while watching her husband make decision after a decision that undermined everything she built, while watching Charles sell stable Wisconsin land to chase Kansas dreams, while packing wagon after wagon, abandoning home after home, losing friends and community and stability every time Charles got restless. The question isn't why Caroline stayed with Charles. In the 1860s and 70s, married women had almost no legal rights, no easy path to divorce, no way to support themselves and 4 children independently. Leaving wasn't really an option. The question is, when did Caroline start making the decisions that actually mattered? And the answer is, probably earlier than anyone realised, but definitely by the time they reached De Smet. There's a moment sometime in the early 1880s, the exact date isn't recorded, but the fact of it echoes through every decision the family makes afterward, when Caroline Ingalls puts her foot down. Charles wants to move. Again. It's what he does. The restlessness is building. The familiar itch that says the next place will be better, that starting over will somehow fix what's broken. Maybe he's talking about Oregon, maybe Montana, somewhere west, always west, where land is cheaper and opportunities are fresher, and this time it'll work. Caroline says no. Not maybe, not let's think about it. Just no. The family is staying in De Smet. The daughters need stability. They need education. They need community and friends and a town that isn't going to disappear when Charles decides to chase another horizon. And for the first time in their 20-plus years of marriage, Charles listens. This is the shift historians point to when they talk about Caroline becoming the primary decision-maker in the family's later years. Not a dramatic moment. Not a fight or ultimatum recorded in letters. Just a quiet assertion of power that changes everything. Because Charles stops moving. He proves up the De Smet homestead. He builds the 3rd Street house in town and the family settles there, and Charles never relocates again. Why does Caroline win this fight when she'd lost so many others? Maybe because Charles is finally exhausted, worn down by 20 years of failure. Maybe because the girls are older now. Mary 16, Laura 14, Carrie 11, and their needs matter in ways they didn't when they were babies Charles could load into wagons without asking. Or maybe because Caroline has learned something crucial about her husband. Charles needs someone to make decisions for him. Not because he's weak, but because his own restlessness will destroy him if someone doesn't impose limits. Caroline becomes that limit. And here's what that decision costs her. She never gets to go back to Wisconsin. Caroline's family, the Quiners, stayed in Wisconsin. Her brother Henry stayed. Her brother-in-law Peter Ingalls, Charles's own brother, stayed. They all prospered, buying land, establishing farms, building stability, while Charles dragged Caroline across 4 states chasing promises that evaporated. Caroline knows this. She knows her siblings have security she'll never have. She knows her childhood friends grew old in the same houses where they raised children. Yeah, while she's moved a dozen times. She knows that if she'd married someone else, someone stable, someone content to stay put, her life would have been easier. But she married Charles. And staying in De Smet means accepting that she'll never go home. that Wisconsin, the place she grew up, the place where her family still lives, will remain hundreds of miles away for the rest of her life. It's a sacrifice Charles never quite acknowledges. He gets to stop moving, finally achieving the stability Caroline wanted all along. But Caroline pays for that stability with permanent distance from her own family, and she does it anyway because her daughter's futures matter more than her own past. Mary, blind since 1879, needs a supportive community where people know her, where she can navigate safely, where she can contribute to the family income by making fly nets for horses and doing sewing work she can manage without sight. Moving her to a new place would be cruel. Laura is teaching, starting her own life, courting Ingalls Wilder. Uprooting her now would destroy relationships she's building, opportunities she's earned. Carrie and Grace need education, proper schooling, preparation for lives that might be better than their parents' lives. That requires staying in one place long enough for school to matter. So Caroline makes the choice. The family stays. And Charles, for once, doesn't fight her. This is Caroline's victory. But victories on the frontier don't look like triumphs. They look like exhaustion and compromise and making the best of circumstances you never wanted in the first place. Because Caroline's life in De Smet isn't easy. Charles retires from farming in the late 1880s, his health failing, his body worn out from decades of hard labour that never quite paid off. The family survives on Charles's odd jobs, carpentry, town work, his position as Justice of the Peace, and whatever income Caroline can generate from boarders and selling eggs and the 100 small economies frontier women use to stretch inadequate money. When Charles dies in June 1902, Caroline is 62 years old. She's been married for 42 years. She's outlived the husband who dragged her across the frontier, and now she has to figure out how to survive without him. She doesn't remarry, she doesn't move. She stays in the 3rd Street house with Mary, her blind eldest daughter, and together they take in boarders to generate income. The Green family rents rooms from them, and over the years the Greens become so close they're almost family. This is Caroline's life after Charles, managing a boarding house, caring for Mary, staying connected to Laura, Carrie and Grace as they build their own families. It's quiet, it's unglamorous. It's the kind of life that doesn't generate stories about frontier adventure or pioneer triumph, but it's stable. For the first time since she married Charles in 1860, Caroline's life isn't defined by movement or crisis or someone else's restless decisions. She controls her own space, makes her own choices, lives on her own terms. She lives like this for 22 years, longer than she lived with Charles in De Smet, longer than any single phase of her married life. From 1902 to 1924, Caroline Ingalls is finally, blessedly, still. And when she dies on April 20th, 1924, at age 84, she's buried in De Smet Cemetery next to Charles, surrounded by the daughters who survived everything with her. The town remembers her as Ma Ingalls, the gentle pioneer mother. But the people who knew her remember something else. The woman who said no to one more move, who insisted on stability when her husband wanted motion, who outlived her restless husband by 2 decades, and built a life he never could have imagined. When Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down in the 1930s to write the Little House books, she had to make a decision about her mother. She could tell the truth, that Caroline Quiner Ingalls worked brutal, grinding hours doing invisible labour, that she went into fields to help with haying, that she worked in a hotel alongside her young daughters, that she became the family's primary decision-maker in their later years, overriding Charles's restlessness to keep the family stable. Or she could create Ma, the refined, proper frontier mother who stayed in the house, who disapproved of rough work, who represented civilization and manners and everything that separated settlers from savagery. Laura chose the myth. Here's why that choice matters. The Ma Ingalls in Laura's books isn't just a character. She's become the template for how millions of Americans understand frontier women's lives. Ma is gentle, calm, always dressed properly, always maintaining standards even in a log cabin. She doesn't complain. She doesn't break down. She supports Pa's decisions even when those decisions uproot the family again and again. That version of Ma erases the real Caroline's power, her labour, her resistance, and her ultimate victory. It turns a complex, tough, economically crucial woman into a supporting character in Pa's adventure story. Laura did this consciously. Her daughter Rose Wilder Lane, who edited the Little House books heavily, pushed Laura to romanticize frontier life, to emphasize self-reliance and triumph over hardship. Rose had her own political agenda. She was a libertarian who believed in radical individualism, and the Little House books became, in part, propaganda for that worldview. So Caroline's government relief gets erased. Caroline's paid work gets sanitized. Caroline's decision to force Charles to stay in De Smet becomes invisible. Instead, we get Ma in a rocking chair, sewing, while Pa plays the fiddle and tells stories. But here's what Laura preserved, even if she didn't mean to: the evidence of Caroline's strength in small moments. Ma making soup last longer by adding more water. Ma keeping calm during blizzards when everyone else is terrified. Ma managing when Pa leaves for railroad work, keeping the children safe and fed without complaint. Laura couldn't completely erase her mother's competence, because that competence is what kept the family alive. So it shows up in tiny details, in the background of scenes focused on Pa, in the moments where Ma's quiet efficiency makes survival possible. Reading the Little House books carefully, knowing the real history, you can see Caroline underneath Ma. You can see the woman who survived 20 years of moving by being tougher than her husband, by doing work he never acknowledged, by finally saying no when saying no mattered most. The question is, why did Laura choose to hide her mother's strength? Why turn Caroline into Ma, the supporting character in Pa's story? Maybe because the 1930s audience wanted gentle frontier mothers, not exhausted working women. Maybe because Laura was protecting her father's legacy, making Charles into Pa so readers wouldn't see his failures. Maybe because Laura herself believed the myth by then, having spent 60 years telling herself her childhood was an adventure instead of an endurance test. Or maybe because telling the truth about Caroline meant admitting something uncomfortable, that women's labour on the frontier was invisible, uncompensated, legally erased and still absolutely crucial. That Caroline did twice the work Charles did and received none of the credit. That frontier settlement was built on women's invisible labour, and acknowledging that would undermine the entire myth of frontier masculinity. So Laura made Caroline into Ma, and generations of readers learned the wrong lesson about frontier women's lives. But Caroline herself, the real woman, lived a life that tells the truth Laura couldn't write. She worked in hotels. She went into fields. She became the primary decision-maker. She insisted on stability and won. She outlived Charles by 22 years and spent that time managing a boarding house, caring for Mary, staying connected to her daughters' lives. And when she died in 1924, she was buried in De Smet, the town she chose, the place she insisted on making home. The victory Charles never quite gave her credit for. Her gravestone says, Caroline L. Ingalls, 1839 to 1924, wife of Charles P. Ingalls. Even in death, she's defined by her relationship to Charles, not by her own work or decisions. But the people who knew her, the boarders she housed, the daughters she raised, the community she helped build, they knew better. They knew Caroline was the reason the family survived. Not because Charles built houses, but because Caroline held everything together when those houses weren't enough. Here's the real story of Caroline Ingalls. She married a restless man in 1860, thinking she was choosing stability. She spent 20 years being proven wrong. She moved a dozen times. She worked invisible labour that kept her family alive through disasters that killed thousands of other families. She bore 4 daughters and raised them through poverty and environmental catastrophe and constant instability. And then, sometime in the early 1880s, she decided enough was enough. She told Charles they were staying in De Smet. She prioritised her daughter's education and futures over her husband's restlessness. She became the decision-maker the family needed, even if frontier law and social custom said that role belonged to Charles. She won. The family stayed. Charles stopped moving. and Caroline lived long enough to see her daughters build stable lives she never had. Laura becoming a writer, Carrie working in stores and teaching, Grace marrying a farmer and settling 7 miles from De Smet. Mary, blind but contributing, living with Caroline until Caroline's death. That's triumph, not the sanitized, romanticized triumph of Laura's books, where Ma represents civilization and Pa represents adventure. But real triumph, the triumph of insisting on stability, of doing invisible work that matters, of outliving your restless husband and spending 2 decades finally, blessedly, still. Laura couldn't write that story in the 1930s. The audience wasn't ready. The myth was more marketable. So she turned Caroline into Ma, gentle and supportive and invisible in all the ways frontier women's labour was always invisible. But we can tell the real story now. We can say Caroline Quiner Ingalls was tougher than Charles. She worked harder. She made better decisions. She held the family together through 20 years of Charles's failures and finally forced him to succeed by refusing to move again. She doesn't get her name on the Homestead Papers, but she's the reason the homestead succeeded. She's the reason the family survived. She's the reason Laura lived long enough to write books that transformed her parents into legends. And maybe, finally, it's time we remember Caroline as she actually was, not Ma, the supporting character in Pa's adventure, but Caroline, the woman who said no, who stayed put, who won. Caroline Ingalls' unpaid labour, the cooking, sewing, water hauling, child rearing, food preservation, and endless work that kept her family alive, never appeared in any government ledger. When Charles filed his homestead claim in 1880, the paperwork asked for proof of improvements, buildings, fences, ploughed acreage. It didn't ask about the meals Caroline cooked, the clothes she sewed, the garden she maintained, the children she educated. That work was invisible. It didn't count as improvement under the Homestead Act. But without Caroline's labour, Charles's 160 acres would have been worthless. You can't prove up a homestead if your family starves before the 5 years are up. You can't build houses if no one's making the food that gives you energy to lift logs. You can't farm if your children die from neglect while you're in the fields. Women's unpaid labour subsidised every single homestead in America. And the Homestead Act pretended that labour didn't exist. That's the first lie about free land. It wasn't free. It cost women's bodies, women's time, women's exhaustion. It cost marriages like Caroline's, where she spent 20 years following a restless husband because the law gave her no other choice. It cost stability, community, safety, all sacrificed for land that was supposed to make families independent, but mostly just made them poor. But even if you count only the costs the Homestead Act acknowledged, the ones performed by men, the visible labour, the land still wasn't free. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act on May 20th, 1862. It promised 160 acres to any adult head of household willing to live on the land and farm it for 5 years. The filing fee was $10. After 5 years, you'd own the land outright, except for a small registration fee. That's the promise. Free land. The American dream packaged as federal policy. Just move west, work hard, and you'll own a farm. Here's the reality. Starting a homestead cost approximately $1,000. You need a plough. A good steel plough cost $15 to $25 in the 1870s, a month's wages for a labourer. You need oxen or horses to pull that plough. A team of oxen cost $50 to $100. You need seed to plant. Wheat seed cost $1 to $2 per bushel, and you needed multiple bushels to plant 160 acres. You need tools, an axe, a saw, hammers, nails. You need cooking equipment, pots, pans, a stove if you can afford one. You need a gun for hunting and protection. You need basic furniture. You need enough food to survive the first season before any crops come in. You need clothing, bedding, medical supplies. All of this costs money. Money most homesteaders didn't have. So they bought on credit, borrowing from merchants and banks at interest rates that range from 10% to 40% per year. That's the debt cycle that trapped families like the Ingalls. Charles borrowed to start farming. If the harvest succeeded, he could pay back the loan. If the harvest failed, because of drought, grasshoppers, hail, early frost, Any of 100 variables he couldn't control. He couldn't pay back the loan. The debt accumulated, interest compounded. Eventually, foreclosure or relocation became the only options. Charles Ingalls lived that cycle for 20 years. He borrowed to start farming in Wisconsin. He sold that land to speculate in Missouri. Missouri failed, so he moved to Kansas, illegally on tribal land. Kansas failed, so he returned to Wisconsin. Wisconsin couldn't sustain them, so he moved to Minnesota. Minnesota's grasshopper plague destroyed 5 consecutive harvests. Forcing him into railroad work and government relief, Burr Oak was wage labour, not farming. Dakota Territory finally worked, but only because Charles had learned not to depend entirely on crops. That's not the story of a lazy man or a bad farmer. That's the story of a system designed to fail small farmers while pretending to help them. And Charles wasn't unusual. By 1900, only 52% of homesteaders had successfully proved up their claims and taken legal title to the land. Nearly half failed and abandoned their homesteads. Of the 500 million acres of public land the federal government distributed between 1862 and 1904 under various land acts, only 80 million acres, 16%, actually went to small farmers who intended to settle and farm. The rest went to speculators, railroads, mining companies, and large landholders who used legal loopholes to acquire massive tracts. The Homestead Act, sold as a policy to help poor families, primarily benefited wealthy speculators. And the families who believed the promise, families like the Ingalls, paid the price. Here's why this matters. The Homestead Act's failure wasn't accidental, it was structural. The policy was designed in ways that made small-scale farming nearly impossible, especially west of the 100th meridian where climate conditions required larger plots than 160 acres to farm successfully. Congress designed the Homestead Act based on farming conditions in Ohio and Indiana, places with regular rainfall, fertile soil and temperate climates. They applied that same 160-acre template to Montana, Dakota Territory, Kansas and Nebraska, places where rainfall was scarce. Soil was poor and weather was extreme. It's like designing a policy to help people buy houses, but requiring that every house be exactly 800 square feet regardless of whether it's in rural Kansas or Manhattan. The policy ignores geographic and economic reality, guaranteeing that most people who try it will fail. That's what the Homestead Act did to families like the Ingalls. It promised them a path to prosperity while setting conditions that made prosperity nearly impossible. And then, when families failed, the dominant ideology blamed them personally. Poverty became a character flaw, not a structural outcome. This is the myth Charles and Caroline lived inside. The belief that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. That if you just tried hard enough, the land would reward you. That failure meant you didn't work hard enough, didn't sacrifice enough, didn't want it badly enough. But the Ingalls family did work hard. Charles built houses, ploughed fields, took railroad jobs, did whatever paid. Caroline worked invisible labour that kept everyone alive. The children helped with chores from the time they could walk. The family sacrificed stability, community, safety, everything, chasing the promise of land ownership, and they barely made it. They survived, yes, but survival isn't prosperity, and the promise was prosperity. Let's talk about railroads, because understanding railroads is understanding why small farmers like Charles couldn't win. In the 1870s and 1880s, railroads controlled Western agricultural economies completely. They owned the tracks that carried grain to market. They owned the grain elevators that stored crops. They set shipping rates with no competition and no regulation. Here's how that worked in practice. Charles grows wheat on his Minnesota or Dakota claim. He harvests it. Now he needs to get it to market, to mills in Minneapolis or Chicago where it can be sold. But he's 50 to 200 miles from those markets, and wagons can't economically transport grain that far. So he has to use the railroad, and the railroad knows this. They know farmers have no alternative, so they charge whatever they want. Shipping rates for farmers in the 1880s could consume 30% to 50% of the crop's value. If Charles's wheat sold for $1 per bushel in Chicago, The railroad might charge 40 to 50 cents per bushel to ship it there. That doesn't leave much profit, especially after you subtract the cost of seed, tools, labour and loan interest. And it gets worse. Railroads charge different rates depending on competition. If a town had multiple railroad lines, shipping was cheaper because companies competed. If a town had only one line, like most frontier settlements, the railroad charged monopoly rates. De Smet, where the Ingalls finally settled, had one railroad line, the Chicago and Northwestern. That company could charge whatever it wanted, and farmers had to pay or watch their grain rot. This is why Charles worked for the railroad instead of just farming. Railroad wages were low, $1 to $1.50 per day, but they were guaranteed. Crops might fail, but the railroad always paid. That reliable income kept the family alive when farming alone would have bankrupted them. Now add grain elevators to the system. These were massive storage facilities, usually owned by railroad companies or businessmen allied with railroads. Farmers couldn't store large amounts of grain themselves. Homestead houses were too small, and grain spoils if not stored properly, so farmers had to use the elevators. And elevator owners set their own prices for storage, often in coordination with railroad companies. If you wanted to ship grain, you used the elevator. If you used the elevator, you paid their fees. The system was designed to extract maximum profit from farmers at every step. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented historical fact. Farmers in the 1870s to 1890s organised politically specifically to fight railroad and elevator monopolies. The Grange Movement, the Farmers' Alliance, the Populist Party, all of these emerged because farmers understood the system was rigged against them. But Charles Ingalls wasn't a political organiser. He was a small farmer trying to survive, and survival meant accepting exploitative shipping rates, because the alternative was not shipping your grain at all. Now let's talk about speculators, because they're the third piece of why the Homestead Act failed small farmers. The Act was supposed to prevent land speculation. The intent was to give land to people who would actually farm it, not to investors who'd buy it cheap and sell it expensive. That's why the law required 5 years of residence and cultivation before you could take title. But speculators found loopholes immediately. Well, here's one. You could pay $1.25 per acre after 6 months of minimal residence and claim you'd improved the land. Speculators built tiny shacks, sometimes just 12 feet by 14 feet, barely large enough to stand in, lived there for 6 months, paid the fee and flipped the land for profit. Or they hired dummy claimants, people who'd file claims, live just long enough to meet requirements, then sign the land over to the speculator who'd paid them. Or they bribed land office investigators, who were underfunded, overworked and poorly paid. The General Land Office, the federal agency overseeing homesteads, couldn't hire enough investigators to monitor millions of acres. Corruption was rampant. Between 1862 and 1904, large speculators and corporations acquired 400 million of the 500 million acres the government distributed, 80% of the total. Small farmers trying to actually homestead got 80 million acres, 16%. The remaining 4% went to other uses. That means the Homestead Act, the policy supposedly designed to help poor families, primarily enriched wealthy investors and corporations. It redistributed public land upward, increasing economic inequality while telling poor families their failure was their own fault. And here's the part that should make you angry. The federal government knew this was happening. Politicians received reports about fraud and speculation. They knew failure rates were catastrophic. They knew 160 acres was too small for Western farming, and they did almost nothing to fix it. Because the powerful interests benefiting from the system, railroads, speculators, large landholders, had political influence small farmers didn't have. They lobbied Congress. They funded campaigns. They shaped policy to benefit themselves. Charles Ingalls, signing government relief documents in 1876, had no lobbyists. Caroline, hauling water and sewing clothes and keeping her family alive, had no political power. Their daughters, who moved a dozen times before age 10, had no voice in policy debates. The system extracted their labour, their health, their stability, and gave them just enough hope to keep trying. That's not opportunity. That's exploitation dressed up as the American dream. And the Ingalls family story, the real story, not Laura's romanticised version, proves it. They tried for 20 years. They worked harder than most people can imagine, and they barely survived, achieving land ownership only in their 50s after decades of failure. If the system worked, families like the Ingalls would have succeeded easily. The fact that success required superhuman effort and incredible luck reveals the system was broken. You might be thinking, this is history. The Homestead Act ended over a century ago. Why does it matter now? Because the lie didn't end. It just changed forms. The myth the Homestead Act sold, that poverty is a personal failure, that hard work guarantees success, that anyone can prosper if they just try hard enough, is the same myth that dominates American economic discourse today. We call it different things now. Bootstrap mentality, hustle culture, the self-made success story. But it's the same lie Charles Ingalls believed, that individual effort can overcome structural inequality. Here's how this connects to women's lives in 2026. You're told you can have it all if you just work hard enough. Career, family, financial security, personal fulfillment. It's all possible if you sacrifice enough, optimize enough, lean in enough. But just like Caroline Ingalls' unpaid labour subsidising Charles's homestead, women's unpaid domestic labour and emotional labour still subsidise the economy. You're expected to work full-time jobs while also managing households, raising children, caring for ageing parents, and maintaining relationships. That labour is invisible, uncompensated, and taken for granted, exactly like it was in 1880. And when women struggle under that impossible burden, the dominant narrative blames them personally. You're not organised enough. You're not efficient enough. You should have better boundaries. You should prioritise better. The system that creates the burden is never questioned. That's the Homestead Act logic. Promise opportunity while creating structural barriers, then blame individuals when they fail to overcome those barriers, or consider debt. Charles Ingalls borrowed money to start farming, betting on future harvests that might not come. When grasshoppers destroyed those harvests 5 years in a row, the debt didn't disappear. It accumulated, trapping him in a cycle he couldn't escape, except by moving again. Today, millions of Americans are trapped in similar debt cycles. Student loans you took out believing education would guarantee good jobs. Medical debt from healthcare costs that bankrupted you despite having insurance. Credit card debt accumulated because wages haven't kept pace with living costs. The structure is the same. Borrow against future earnings, hope nothing goes wrong, and when something inevitably goes wrong, face financial ruin. And just like in the 1870s, the dominant narrative blames individuals. You shouldn't have taken out those loans. You should have saved more. You should have worked harder, chosen a different career, been more financially literate. The structural problems, stagnant wages, exploitative lending, lack of social safety nets, are ignored. The Homestead Act promised free land while hiding the $1,000 startup cost. Modern systems promise opportunity while hiding the structural barriers that prevent most people from accessing it. The promises change, but the pattern doesn't. Here's what the Ingalls story teaches us. Charles and Caroline weren't failures. They were victims of a system designed to extract their labour while providing minimal support. They worked incredibly hard. They sacrificed constantly. They did everything the dominant ideology said they should do, and they barely survived. Not because they weren't tough enough or smart enough or dedicated enough, but because the system was rigged against small farmers from the start. Understanding that, really understanding it, changes how you see poverty and success in America. It shifts the question from, why didn't they work harder, to, why was the system designed to make success nearly impossible? That's a question that makes powerful people uncomfortable. Because answering it honestly means admitting that economic inequality isn't primarily about individual choices. It's about structural design, about who has power and who doesn't, about systems that benefit some people at others' expense. The Homestead Act benefited railroads, speculators and large landholders. It extracted labour from small farmers and gave them just enough hope to keep trying. It blamed them when they failed, reinforcing the myth that poverty is a personal failure rather than a structural outcome. Modern economic systems work the same way. They extract labour from working people, especially women, especially people of colour, especially anyone without inherited wealth, while telling them they're not working hard enough. They create structural barriers and call them personal challenges. They redistribute wealth upward and call it merit. Laura Ingalls. Wilder wrote her Little House books during the Great Depression, when millions of Americans were living the same precarity her family experienced on the frontier. She gave them Pa Ingalls, the heroic pioneer who overcame every obstacle through determination and hard work. That story was comforting. It said, "If Pa could survive the frontier, you can survive the Depression. Just keep trying. Just work harder. Just don't give up." But the real Charles Ingalls, the man who relied on government relief, who worked railroad jobs because farming failed, who moved constantly because he couldn't make any single place work, tells a different story. Truer story. A story about structural inequality and systems designed to exploit, not empower. We need to tell that story, not to dishonour Charles and Caroline, but to honour their real struggle, to admit that the frontier wasn't triumph, it was survival. That hard work isn't always enough, that sometimes the system is broken, and acknowledging that isn't giving up, it's facing reality. Because only when you face reality can you change it. Only when you stop blaming yourself for structural problems can you start demanding structural solutions. The Ingalls family survived. Barely. And their story, told honestly, is about the cost of surviving in a system designed to extract everything you have while promising you'll prosper. That's the real American frontier. That's the real American dream. And it's time we stopped pretending otherwise. The system that failed Charles Ingalls didn't end with his death in 1902. It kept failing people, millions of them, through the next 3 decades. By 1930, America was 2 years into the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing, farms were foreclosing, unemployment hit 25%. Families were living the same precarity the Ingalls experienced on the frontier, working desperately, struggling constantly, and wondering if hard work actually mattered when the entire economic system was broken. And in a farmhouse in Mansfield, Missouri, a 63-year-old woman named Laura Ingalls Wilder bought a stack of cheap notebooks and started writing. She called her manuscript Pioneer Girl. It was an autobiography, 74,000 words written in pencil on lined paper, telling the story of her childhood from Wisconsin through her marriage to Almanzo Wilder in 1885. And here's what matters. Pioneer Girl told the truth. Laura wrote about her father's illegal settlement on Osage tribal land in Kansas. She wrote about the grasshopper plague destroying their crops year after year. She wrote about government relief. She wrote about moving constantly because Charles couldn't make any place work. She wrote about poverty and failure and the grinding uncertainty that defined her childhood. It was honest. It was raw. It was the story we've been telling in this video, the real Charles Ingalls, not the mythical pair. Laura finished Pioneer Girl in May 1930 and gave the manuscript to her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane. Rose was a successful writer. She'd published novels, worked as a journalist, written magazine stories that paid thousands of dollars. She had connections with publishers in New York. She knew the business. And Laura hoped Rose could help her get Pioneer Girl published. Rose read her mother's manuscript, and then she did something that would change American literature and American mythology forever. She told her mother the truth wasn't marketable. Adults in 1930 didn't want to read about frontier failure. They wanted hope. They wanted stories about people who overcame obstacles, who succeeded through hard work and determination, who proved the American dream was real. Pioneer Girl, with its honest depiction of Charles's failures and the family's poverty, wasn't that story. It was depressing. It was a downer. No publisher would buy it. But Rose saw something else. She saw that if Laura rewrote the story for children, simplified it, romanticized it, turned failure into adventure and poverty into noble simplicity, it could work. It could sell. It could give Depression-era Americans exactly what they needed. proof that their ancestors survived hard times so they could survive too. So Rose made Laura an offer. She'd help rewrite Pioneer Girl as a children's book. She'd edit it, restructure it, use her publishing connections to get it sold. But they'd have to change things. A lot of things. The government relief? Gone. Charles's illegal Kansas settlement? Sanitized. The constant moving? Reframed as adventure instead of desperation. Caroline's exhaustion and quiet resistance? Softened into Ma's gentle disapproval. Charles's failures? Transformed into Pa's heroic perseverance. Laura agreed. Maybe she needed the money. She and Almanzo were struggling farmers themselves during the Depression. Maybe she wanted to protect her father's memory. Maybe she genuinely believed the romanticized version was more true to the spirit of her childhood, even if the facts were different. Or maybe Laura understood something that we're still wrestling with today. Sometimes the myth is more powerful than the truth. Sometimes people need stories that comfort them, even if those stories aren't entirely honest. Rose sat down at her typewriter in July 1930 and started rewriting her mother's story. She called it a juvenile, industry term for children's book. She cut the darkness. She simplified the language. She added scenes that emphasized family unity and pioneer spirit. She removed every reference to structural inequality and government assistance. And then she did something more subtle, more insidious. She infused the story with her own political ideology. Rose Wilder Lane wasn't just a writer. She was a libertarian political activist. She believed in radical individualism, minimal government, free markets unconstrained by regulation. She'd written glowing biographies of Herbert Hoover. She opposed the New Deal programs Franklin Roosevelt was implementing to address the Depression. She believed poverty was primarily caused by government interference, not structural inequality. And she put those beliefs into Laura's books, carefully, subtly, in ways most children reading them would never notice. By August 17th, 1930, Rose had finished the first rewrite. She sent it to publishers. It got rejected. She rewrote it again. More rejections. Laura's original Pioneer Girl manuscript also got shopped around to publishers. No one wanted it. But Rose kept trying. She kept rewriting, restructuring, shaping Laura's memories into the story she wanted to tell. And finally, in 1932, Harper & Brothers agreed to publish the children's version. On April 6, 1932, Little House in the Big Woods hit bookstores. It was an immediate success. Children loved it. Parents loved it. Teachers used it in classrooms. It sold thousands of copies, then tens of thousands, then more. And Laura, who'd spent 2 years watching her daughter edit and reshape and fundamentally alter the story she originally wrote, became a famous children's author. But she wasn't really the author anymore. Not entirely. Because the books that made Laura Ingalls Wilder a household name weren't the books Laura originally wanted to write. They were the books Rose Wilder Lane decided America needed to read. And the difference between those two versions, between what Laura wrote and what Rose published, tells you everything about how myths get made, about how hard truths get softened, about how a daughter rewrote her father's failures and turned them into America's favourite story about pioneer success. But here's what Laura didn't know when she agreed to let Rose reshape her story. Once you create a myth that powerful, you can't control it. It takes on a life of its own. It becomes bigger than truth, and it shapes how entire generations understand history, poverty, success, and what it means to be American. Laura thought she was writing children's books. What she actually created, or what Rose helped her create, was propaganda. The most effective kind, the kind that doesn't feel like propaganda at all. The kind that feels like memory, nostalgia, truth. And for the next 90 years, millions of people would read those books and believe they were learning about the real frontier, the real Charles Ingalls, the real American pioneer experience. They weren't. They were learning a myth, a beautiful, comforting, politically motivated myth that erased structural inequality and replaced it with bootstrap individualism. But to understand how completely Rose transformed Laura's story, You need to see what got left out, what Rose cut, what she changed, what she decided American children shouldn't know about their frontier heritage. Rose Wilder Lane didn't just edit her mother's manuscripts, she rewrote them, sometimes from scratch. The original Pioneer Girl manuscript, when it was finally published in 2014, 84 years after Laura wrote it, revealed just how much Rose changed. Entire sections were deleted, events were reordered, tone was completely transformed. The story Laura told and the story that got published were fundamentally different. Let's look at specific examples, because this is where you see the myth-making happen in real time. In Pioneer Girl, Laura describes her father accepting government relief during the grasshopper years. She writes matter-of-factly, "They needed help. Charles went to the county office. They got flour." It's presented as survival, not shame. Just one of many things frontier families did to get through disasters. In the published Little House books, that entire storyline disappears. The grasshopper plague is mentioned in On the Banks of Plum Creek, published 1937, but there's no government relief. Instead, Pa works railroad jobs, and the family makes do through his wages and their own resourcefulness. Self-reliance, not government assistance, saves them. Rose cut the relief, deliberately. Because acknowledging that Charles needed government help would undermine the political message she was building, that individuals succeed or fail based on their own efforts, that government intervention is unnecessary, that the frontier proved American exceptionalism. Or look at Charles's Kansas settlement. In Pioneer Girl, Laura describes her father building on land he knew was Osage territory, hoping the government would eventually open it to white settlement. She describes the family's forced evacuation when that didn't happen. It's complicated. Charles is both a victim of unclear land policy and a participant in settler colonialism. In Little House on the Prairie, published 1935, the Kansas story becomes a dramatic adventure. Pa builds a house in Indian Territory, yes, but it's framed as bold pioneering rather than illegal squatting. The Osage people are portrayed as threats rather than the rightful landowners being displaced. And when the family has to leave, it's presented as government interference with honest settlers, not enforcement of indigenous land rights. Rose made those choices. She softened the colonialism. She erased Charles's complicity. She turned a morally ambiguous situation into a simple story of pioneers versus government versus Indians. Why? Because Rose's political ideology required clear villains and heroes. Government was the villain. Pioneers were the heroes. Indigenous peoples were obstacles. That framework couldn't accommodate the messy reality that Charles knowingly settled land that wasn't his and got removed because he was breaking the law. But the most significant change Rose made wasn't any single event. It was the overall tone and message of the books. Laura's Pioneer Girl is about survival. It's about a family moving constantly, struggling endlessly, barely making it. There's love in it. Laura clearly adores her father, respects her mother, but there's also exhaustion and uncertainty, and the sense that frontier life was genuinely hard in ways that broke people. Rose's published Little House series is about triumph. Yes, there are hard moments, blizzards, and crop failures, difficult moves, but the overall arc is upward. Pa always finds a way, the family always survives, hard work always pays off. The message is clear. America rewards those who persevere. That tonal shift turns history into ideology. It says, your ancestors succeeded through grit and determination, so you can too. It says, if you're struggling, it's because you're not working hard enough. It says, structural problems don't exist, only individual failures. And that message, delivered to children through engaging stories about a beloved family, shaped how generations of Americans understood poverty, success, and the role of government in addressing inequality. Rose knew what she was doing. Her diary entries from the 1930s, her letters to other libertarian activists, her own published writings, all of it shows a woman consciously using the Little House books to advance her political beliefs. She wrote 2 adult novels during the same period, Let the Hurricane Roar, 1932, and Freeland, 1938. Both retell pioneer stories, emphasizing self-reliance and minimal government. They're basically the adult versions of the Little House books, with the political messaging made explicit instead of subtle. Rose was building a brand, a vision of American history that supported her libertarian politics, and she used her mother's memories as raw material. But here's the question that should haunt anyone who loves the Little House books. Did Laura know? Did she understand how much Rose was changing? Did she agree with the political messages being woven into her childhood stories? The evidence suggests yes. Laura and Rose corresponded extensively during the writing process. Laura saw the edits. She approved them. She even adopted some of Rose's political views herself in later years. But the evidence also suggests Laura was uncomfortable sometimes. There are letters where she pushes back on Rose's changes, where she insists certain facts stay accurate, where she seems to realize the published version is drifting too far from reality. Ultimately, though, Laura let it happen. She let Rose reshape her story. She let the myth replace the truth. She became complicit in creating a version of frontier history that erased her father's failures, her mother's struggles, and the structural inequality that defined their lives. Maybe she felt she had no choice. Rose controlled access to publishers, and Laura needed income during the Depression. Maybe she genuinely believed the romanticized version honoured her parents better than the truth would. Maybe she was tired of poverty defining her family's legacy and wanted to give them something better to be remembered for. Or maybe Laura understood something we're still learning, that storytelling is power, that whoever controls the narrative controls how history is remembered, and that sometimes creating a useful myth is more important than preserving an uncomfortable truth. But myths have consequences, and the myth Laura and Rose created has been shaping American politics, American education, and American understanding of poverty for 90 years. So what exactly did that myth leave out? What truths disappeared when Rose edited Laura's memories? Let's list what Laura Ingalls Wilder left out of her Little House books. The things Rose decided American children shouldn't know about frontier life. Government relief. Charles signed documents swearing he was wholly without means to get flour during the grasshopper plague. Thousands of frontier families relied on government assistance to survive environmental disasters. The myth of pure self-reliance was always a lie. Debt. Charles bought supplies on credit constantly. He borrowed to start farming. He owed money he couldn't pay back. Debt cycles trapped frontier families just like they trap families today. But the Little House books make it seem like the Ingalls family lived simply by choice, not because poverty forced them to. Charles's failures. He abandoned homestead claims in Missouri, Kansas, and Minnesota. He moved constantly, not because he was adventurous, but because he couldn't make any place work economically. By any objective measure, Charles failed at frontier settlement for 20 years. But Pa Ingalls in the books is resourceful and successful. Caroline's resistance. She didn't want to move. She argued against Charles's decisions. She ultimately forced him to stay in De Smet by refusing to move again. But Ma in the books is supportive and submissive, never openly challenging Pa's authority. Caroline's economic role. She worked in hotels. She took in boarders. She did paid labour to keep the family afloat. But Ma in the book stays in the house, doing domestic work that's portrayed as natural and non-economic rather than crucial paid and unpaid labour. The hard winter's severity. Laura wrote an entire book about it, The Long Winter, but even that sanitised version doesn't fully capture how close the family came to starving. The railroad company blockades, the near-total absence of food, the psychological toll, all of it is softened for child readers. Burr Oak. Laura almost completely erased the year the family spent working in an Iowa hotel. It didn't fit the pioneer narrative, wage labour in someone else's business, so it became a footnote, barely mentioned across 8 books. The real reason for moves. The books present each move as a choice, a new opportunity. The reality was usually economic desperation or outright failure forcing them to relocate. Leaving Kansas wasn't romantic adventure. It was federal enforcement of land law against illegal settlers, settler colonialism. The books acknowledge Indians exist but frame them as obstacles or threats. not as peoples being actively displaced by settlers like Charles. Laura couldn't write about her family's complicity in indigenous dispossession, so she erased that context entirely. Women's invisible labour. The books show Ma cooking and sewing, but they don't show the physical toll, the exhaustion, the way Caroline's body broke down from decades of hauling water, bearing children, working without rest. That labour is background, not story. Charles's psychological state. Was he depressed, anxious, struggling with repeated failure in ways that affected his mental health? We don't know, because Laura couldn't write about that in 1930s children's books, and probably couldn't fully see it as a child. But the fiddle playing, the restlessness, the inability to settle, it all suggests psychological patterns modern readers might recognise as trauma responses, the structural inequality, railroad monopolies, speculator fraud, Homestead Act failures, the entire system designed to extract wealth from small farmers. None of that appears in the Little House books. Instead, the books present frontier economics as fair: work hard, succeed, don't work hard, fail, pure meritocracy, political context. The 1870s to 1880s were decades of intense political organising by farmers fighting railroad monopolies and demanding economic reforms. The Grange movement, the Populist Party. None of that exists in Laura's books. Politics is absent, as if frontier families lived isolated from broader economic and political forces. What happened after? The Little House series ends with Laura's marriage in 1885, but her adult life included failures too. Years of struggling to farm, losing a son in infancy, moving multiple times, eventually achieving stability only in middle age. The myth ends at marriage because continuing the story would show frontier hardship never ended. These aren't minor omissions. They're the entire structural context that explains why Charles couldn't succeed, why Caroline had to work so hard, why the family moved constantly, why frontier settlement was precarious for millions of families. And removing that context transforms the story completely. It turns a narrative about structural inequality into a narrative about individual perseverance. It turns systemic failure into personal triumph. It turns historical reality into propaganda. Laura made these choices consciously. With Rose's guidance, yes, but Laura approved the final manuscripts. She knew she was softening the truth. She knew the books didn't fully represent what her childhood was like. She even admitted it in later interviews, saying the books were true to the spirit of her experiences even when the facts were changed. That phrase, true to the spirit, is how people justify myth-making. It says, the emotional truth matters more than factual truth. It says, if changing facts creates better meaning, that's acceptable. It says, myth is more valuable than history. And maybe Laura was right. Maybe the myth she created of a loving family overcoming frontier hardships through determination does honour something real about her parents' perseverance. Maybe it's more important for children to read inspiring stories than accurate history. But myths have consequences, and the myth Laura created has been teaching Americans for 90 years that poverty is a personal failure, that government assistance is shameful, that structural inequality doesn't exist, only individuals who succeed or fail based on their own efforts. That myth shaped policy debates about welfare, education, healthcare, economic regulation. It shaped how Americans judge poor people, homeless people, anyone struggling economically. It shaped the belief that if you're not succeeding, it's your fault. You're not working hard enough, not sacrificing enough, not embodying the pioneer spirit. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who accepted government relief as a child, who watched her father fail for decades, who knew firsthand that hard work wasn't always enough. She created a myth that denies all of that reality. And now we have to decide, what do we do with that truth? Do we keep teaching the myth to children because it's comforting? Do we tell the real story, even though it's harder and less inspiring? Do we find some middle ground, where we acknowledge both the love in Laura's family and the structural inequality they faced? That's not a question about the past. It's a question about now, about how we teach history, about what stories we tell ourselves about poverty and success, about whether we're brave enough to face the truth Laura couldn't write. The woman who turned her father's failures into America's favourite pioneer story is dead. But the myth she created is still alive, still shaping how we see ourselves. He's still telling us comfortable lies about how America works. And the question is, are we finally ready to stop believing those lies? The question at the end of chapter 6 was, are we ready to stop believing the lies Laura told about her father? But that framing isn't quite right, because calling them lies suggests Laura was being dishonest. What she was actually doing was something more complicated, something more human. She was protecting the people she loved by turning their pain into purpose. Charles Ingalls failed by every economic measure. He moved his family a dozen times. He relied on government relief. He couldn't prove up homesteads in Kansas or Minnesota. He worked railroad jobs and carpentry because farming alone couldn't support his family. By the standards he believed in, self-reliance, land ownership, frontier success, he didn't make it. But here's what he did do. He kept trying. For 42 years of marriage, through disasters that killed thousands of other families, Charles kept his family together and alive. He played his fiddle when everything else was falling apart. He built houses, even knowing they might abandon them. He took humiliating work when pride wouldn't feed his daughters. He survived. And Caroline, she did more than survive. She worked invisible labour that made Charles's visible labour possible. She bore 4 daughters and raised them through poverty and instability. She insisted on staying in despair when Charles wanted to move again. She became the decision-maker the family needed. She outlived Charles by 22 years and built a stable life he never could. That's not failure. That's extraordinary resilience in the face of a system designed to crush people exactly like them. Laura knew this. She watched her parents struggle. She felt the hunger during the hard winter. She moved a dozen times before she turned 18. She understood intimately what frontier life actually cost. And she chose to tell a different story, not because she wanted to lie, but because she wanted her parents' suffering to mean something. She wanted their struggle to inspire people, not depress them. She wanted Charles and Caroline to be remembered as heroes, not victims. That's an act of love. Complicated, problematic love that created harmful myths, but love nonetheless. So when we talk about the lies in the Little House books, we need to hold 2 truths simultaneously. Laura created a myth that obscures structural inequality and has been used to justify harmful policies, and Laura was a daughter honouring her parents the only way she knew how, in a culture that demanded triumph narratives and couldn't accommodate honest stories about structural failure. Both things are true. The myth is harmful. The love behind it is real. And understanding that complexity is crucial, because it's the same complexity millions of women face today. You're told to lean in, hustle harder, optimize everything. You're told that if you're struggling, it's because you're not doing enough. You're told success is always possible if you just work hard enough, sacrifice enough, want it badly enough. And when that doesn't work, when you're exhausted, when the system seems rigged, when hard work isn't enough, you have 2 choices. You can admit the system is broken, which means confronting uncomfortable truths about inequality and injustice. Or you can tell yourself a story where your struggle is noble, where suffering has meaning, where someday all this sacrifice will pay off. Laura chose the second option. She turned structural inequality into personal triumph. She turned her father's failures into Pa's perseverance. She turned Caroline's invisible labour into Ma's gentle domesticity. And millions of people, mostly women, have been making similar choices ever since, working impossible hours while telling themselves it's empowering, sacrificing health and relationships while calling it ambition, and struggling under systems designed to extract maximum labour while believing they just need to try harder. The myth Laura created doesn't just shape how we see history, it shapes how we see ourselves. But here's what we can learn from the real Ingalls family, the one behind the myth. They survived because they helped each other. Charles couldn't have lasted a year without Caroline's labour. Caroline couldn't have fed the family without Charles's wages. The girls contributed from childhood. When disaster struck, they relied on government assistance and community support. The frontier wasn't won by rugged individualists. It was survived by people who worked together, who accepted help when they needed it, who understood that individual effort wasn't enough against structural inequality and environmental catastrophe. That's the real lesson of the Ingalls family. Not bootstrap individualism, but collective survival. Not self-reliance, but interdependence. Not triumph, but resilience in the face of systems designed to break them. Laura couldn't write that story in 1932. Rose wouldn't let her. The publishers wanted triumph narratives. The culture demanded heroes, not victims of structural inequality. But we can tell that story now. We can honour Charles and Caroline's real struggle without pretending it was something it wasn't. We can acknowledge Laura's love for her parents while rejecting the harmful myths she created. Because the real Charles and Caroline Ingalls are more valuable as historical examples than Pa and Ma Ingalls ever were as literary characters. The real family shows us what happens when economic systems fail people. The real family shows us the cost of frontier mythology. The real family shows us why we need structural solutions, not just individual effort. That's a better legacy than the myth. It's truer, it's more useful, and it honours their genuine struggle instead of erasing it with comfortable lies. Charles Ingalls wasn't a hero. He was a man trapped in a system that promised opportunity and delivered exploitation. And understanding that, really understanding it, changes everything about how we see poverty, success, and what we owe each other. The Little House books have sold over 60 million copies. They've been translated into dozens of languages. They've been adapted into television series, musicals, films. They're taught in schools across America. Entire curricula are built around them. That's 60 million people who learned American history through Laura's romanticised lens, who absorbed the message that poverty is a personal failure, who internalised the myth that hard work always pays off, who came to believe that government assistance is shameful and self-reliance is the only honourable path. And that myth has shaped American policy for nearly a century. When politicians argue against welfare programs, they invoke frontier rhetoric. When they oppose healthcare reforms, they talk about self-reliance. When they resist addressing structural inequality, they tell stories about ancestors who succeeded through grit and determination, ancestors like Pa Ingalls. Except Pa Ingalls wasn't real. He was a character Rose Wilder Lane created to advance her libertarian political agenda. He was a myth designed to make structural inequality invisible, and that myth has cost us. It's cost us social programs that could have lifted millions out of poverty. It's cost us economic reforms that could have addressed wealth inequality. It's cost us honest conversations about who succeeds and why, about what it really takes to survive when systems are designed to fail you. It's cost women, specifically, in ways that are still playing out today. The Little House books taught generations of girls that Ma stayed home, stayed quiet, stayed supportive, that her work was natural and effortless, not labour at all, that she never challenged Pa's decisions, never demanded more, never insisted on her own needs mattering as much as his. Caroline Ingalls did none of those things. She worked harder than Charles. She challenged his decisions. She ultimately became the decision-maker. She insisted on stability and won. But millions of women learned from Ma, not Caroline. They learned to make their work invisible, to support their husbands' ambitions above their own needs, to sacrifice endlessly without complaint, to call exploitation dedication, and call exhaustion love. And when modern women burn out trying to do everything, work full-time jobs, manage households, raise children, maintain relationships, all while being told it's empowering, they're living the cost of Laura's myth. Because the myth says, if you're struggling, you're not working hard enough. If you need help, you're weak. If the system is grinding you down, it's your fault for not being tougher. That's the Little House legacy, not inspiration, gaslighting. I mean, it tells you to work harder when the problem is structural. It tells you to be grateful for exploitation. It tells you that asking for help is shameful when the real Ingalls family survives specifically because they asked for help. The myth Laura created has been particularly weaponized against poor women. When single mothers need assistance, they're lectured about self-reliance. using frontier rhetoric that was always a lie. When working women struggle with childcare costs, they're told previous generations managed, ignoring that previous generations had extended family networks and radically different economic conditions. Every time someone invokes the pioneer spirit to justify cutting social programs, they're using Laura's myth against people who need exactly the kind of help Charles Ingalls received during the grasshopper plague. And here's the cruelest irony. Laura's books were published during the Great Depression, when millions of Americans were experiencing exactly the precarity her family faced on the frontier. They needed to understand that their suffering was structural, not personal, that government intervention was necessary and appropriate, that the system, not their effort, was failing. Instead, Laura gave them Pa Ingalls, who overcame everything through individual determination. And Rose Wilder Lane used that story to argue against the New Deal programs that could have helped Depression-era families survive. The myth became a weapon, and it's been used against struggling people ever since. But myths can be dismantled, and understanding the real Ingalls family story is how we start. So what do we do with this truth? How do we honour the real Ingalls family while rejecting the harmful myths created in their name? First, we stop teaching the Little House books as history. They're literature. They're one daughter's mythologised version of her childhood, heavily edited for political purposes. They're valuable as artefacts showing how myths get made, but they're not reliable historical sources. When we teach frontier history, we centre primary sources. Government land records showing homestead failure rates, relief documents like the one Charles signed in 1876, economic data about railroad monopolies and farm debt, Indigenous perspectives on settler colonialism, women's diaries describing the actual labour frontier life required. We teach the structural context Laura erased. We show students why the Homestead Act failed, how economic systems were rigged, what environmental disasters did to farming families. We make structural inequality visible instead of hiding it behind bootstrap narratives. And we teach that accepting help isn't weakness, that government assistance kept frontier families alive, that community support and collective action matter more than individual effort, that the myth of pure self-reliance was always propaganda. Second, we reclaim Caroline's story. We make women's frontier labour visible. We teach about the work Caroline did, the water hauling, food preservation, clothing production, childcare, household management, emotional labour, and economic decision-making that made frontier settlement possible. We show how Caroline became the primary decision-maker, how she insisted on staying in De Smet, how she outlived Charles and built stability he never achieved, how she survived through competence and resistance, not gentle submission. Because young women need to see that. They need to see women in history who demanded more, who challenged male authority, who insisted their needs mattered. They need Caroline, not Ma. Third, we connect past to present. We show how the myths Laura created are still shaping policy debates, still affecting how we judge poor people, still influencing who gets help and who gets blamed. And we ask students, whose interests do these myths serve? Who benefits when we believe poverty is a personal failure? Who profits when we think structural inequality doesn't exist? Those questions are threatening to powerful people, which is exactly why they're important. Fourth, we make space for complexity. We acknowledge that Laura loved her parents, that Rose believed her political ideology was correct, that myths serve psychological needs even when they obscure truth, that history is complicated and people are contradictory, and you can honour someone's humanity while rejecting their harmful legacy. We don't have to cancel Laura Ingalls Wilder. We just have to stop treating her mythologised version of frontier history as definitive. We can appreciate her literary skill while recognising her political agenda. We can understand her love for her parents while rejecting the bootstrap mythology she created. That's intellectual maturity, holding contradictions, seeing complexity, refusing simple narratives that erase uncomfortable truths. And finally, most importantly, we tell ourselves different stories. Instead of, I just need to work harder, we say, the system is rigged and I need allies to change it. Instead of I'm failing, we say I'm struggling against structural barriers. Instead of accepting help is shameful, We say, accepting help is how humans survive. We stop measuring ourselves against Pat Ingalls, who never existed. We stop trying to be Ma Ingalls, who was a sanitized fiction. We stop believing that if we just sacrifice enough, work enough, try enough, we'll overcome structural inequality through sheer determination. That's the lie that killed people on the frontier. And it's still killing people now, through exhaustion, through burnout, through the belief that if you're drowning, you just need to swim harder. The truth is, sometimes you need someone to throw you a rope. Sometimes you need the system to change. Sometimes individual effort isn't enough, and admitting that isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Charles and Caroline Ingalls survived because they accepted help, because they worked together, because Caroline finally insisted on stability over Charles's restless moving. They survived despite the system, not because of it. That's the real pioneer story, not triumph. Survival, not self-reliance. Interdependence, not individual success. Collective resilience. And that story, told honestly, is more powerful than any myth. Because it's true. And truth, however painful, is what sets us free. The end. But Caroline's story isn't over. The grasshopper plague that destroyed Charles's crops didn't just destroy wheat. It destroyed something deeper in Caroline. The belief that if she worked hard enough, if she sacrificed enough, if she just held on long enough, her family would finally be safe. You've heard about the plague in Charles's story, but you haven't heard what it did to Caroline, what it's like to watch 5 summers of work disappear, to ration food for your daughters while your husband leaves to work railroad jobs, to make bread from seed wheat because that's all that's left, to sign your name to a document that tells the entire county you're destitute, to realize that everything you've been told about hard work and sacrifice and the frontier providing for those who deserve it is a lie. There's in the next video we're going back to Minnesota, back to 1873 to 1877, back to the woman who held everything together when the sky turned black and the grasshoppers ate the future. Coming next, Ma Ingalls Inn on the banks of Plum Creek. How the grasshopper plague destroyed Caroline's hope. The story Laura couldn't tell, the woman behind the myth, the mother who survived the unthinkable. Drop your city and local time in the comments below, and if this story changed how you see American history, if it made you question what you've been taught about poverty and success, and who deserves help, share it. Because the truth about the frontier is the truth about now, and we all need to hear it. See you in the next one.